I do this podcast and I stream it is we like to help people do digital transformation with computers, but not lose their self. And so we talked to a lot of different practitioners. And on the line today, we have Don Finkel. He has a tremendous breadth of experience in his field. And he is kind of marching forward into the future of technology, but not forgetting where he came from and has some stories to us to talk about it. Don, thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, glad to
Um,
be here, Peter.
So Don, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and your current role and where you got to get there?
Okay, going back, I started off as an architect, practiced for 10 years, and then I got into a family business, manufacturing hardwood floors. Did that for, I don't know, 30 years, and, built the business into something that we could sell. We sold to Shaw Industries in 2007, Berkshire Hathaway Company. And then I worked for Shaw for 5.5 years, and we built their wood program up. I was in charge of, Shaw Hardwood, and then I retired. Did that for a year and a half, and decided that I, was pretty bored, and so I started another company that made engineered hardwood floors, manufactured them inside a prison in Tennessee, and I had done that, in South Carolina, and it was a program where we paid the inmates civilian wages, voluntary, and the purpose from the government's point of view was to reduce recidivism, which we were able to do. The typical recidivism was in the 60% range. People that got out of prison would come back. And with our program, we were about 1%. So it was successful in that way. It was successful in that we were able to make products that were high quality. Really got into the work because, prison's pretty boring. And so I built eight prison plants making, engineered hardwood floors. And they're still operating. So I started another company doing that, sold it 5 years ago, retired again, and then 2 years ago got bored, started a company, and we make. I had a non-compete on wood, so I couldn't do wood, but we started importing and selling products, hard surface flooring products. And the company name is East Paragon. We sell under the brand name of Bellina, which is Italian for whale. And our thinking was that these were all waterproof, products. And we thought, what has the most affinity for water? Nothing more than a whale. So we named it Bellina. So anyway, that's what we're doing. And go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, and I think like that is kind of a journey that a lot of people have. That is like, there's things that are with technology, but really you're just working with people, right? And so the tools may change from job to job. How do you find the commonality of your past experience helps you when you go off into a new venture, like leaving lumber for different materials and stuff like that?
Well, I think you've got to have relationships with people, and I've been fortunate that I've kind of had good people come into my life, and I was able to recognize that they were good. In a lot of cases, it was not obvious to everybody, but you have to treat people with respect and ethics, and I think the other thing is, I guess I've always felt like you lead from the front. You don't manage people into battle. You lead them into battle. So you have to be willing to do the things that you ask other people to do. I would never ask anybody to do something I wouldn't do. And I think if you're putting out the effort, there's an old saying that the choir does like the preacher, So if you
Yeah.
expect people to work hard and to be honest and all of that, you've got to be that way yourself. And I've been fortunate that I've just, when I work with somebody, and of course, and that's what's kind of nice about, really being in a business that's, kind of on to something, you've got something, and, you become, close to those people, and we tend to remain friends for life.
Yeah. The formative experience of forming a business is like bonds. Like I talk to people from companies I worked with 20 years ago because it's just like, you were there when Disneyland opened, or you were there when some milestone in people's lives changed the arc of their life. And I think that experience kind of transfers into the things you make. So like if you have a good working environment and you're not just like the customer's always right, but the customer has a point and we have a point, and how do we make sure that everyone is like satisfied by the outcome? I think it's super important when you're building tooling, whether it's digital or analog people stuff. So
yeah, I kind of felt like, if somebody thought enough of us and our product to pay money for it, that, we owed them our best effort. And, people vote, with their feet and they vote with their pocketbook.
Yeah.
And so that was an epiphany moment for me one time, and it's been a good while ago when I, became head of manufacturing, which was not my plan. I had to get rid of the person doing it, and I decided that we were customers do our quality control and then argue with them. So, and I think that's the case in any business. If you have a complaint, the complaint is an opportunity to demonstrate your commitment to the product and fair dealing and to the customer. So we took those seriously, and we tried to get them out of the way as possible. Complaints never get better. They're like fish, get better, they get worse.
Yeah. Like supply chains have been a mess for almost half a decade now. And like, how does that change your business when you're in a services type role, but stuff is stuck on a boat in the middle of the ocean because of things? How do you like manage that customer relationship when you can't really predict things like you once were able to?
Well, that's where, having some credibility and some history with customers comes in handy, because, it's easy. Some of these things that have happened, if somebody were to tell somebody we think you're just lying to them, you're actually telling them the truth. So that's been the biggest issue we've had trying to get started. We started off with some customers in China that they the better product. They had we've got a 55% tariff. We had to change. So we know an awful lot of people. The more people you know, the more options you have. Of course, you want people that you know to trust you and believe in you. And so we've had to move around, and it's created some obsolete inventory. We changed suppliers. It's been a little difficult. We've gotten through, and in the process of doing all that change, we had a chance to look at other products. And in some cases, that was a move to change the product because it's a little more advanced. And of course, our business is nothing like the digital business or technology business, where things are changing every day. We're a little bit sedentary. Probably most of your listeners are dealing with.
Well, like I am really in my consultancy, I'm really preaching patience with a lot of this stuff, because you may be feeling like fear of missing out, but also all these companies are being used as beta testers, a lot of this stuff. And, for people that have very strict orchestration patterns they have to do, the difference between reliable tooling but boring tooling might be the make or break things for your year and your quarter. And so, I think it's very hard to like show awareness of technology and opportunities for especially people who control their own destiny to pick a different stack and do things. But also, it's a very interesting time because it's 5 years ago there was 9 nines of SLA quality, and now they're shipping Copilot and says not for business uses. It's only for entertainment purposes. And so, but you'll still charge me $440 a seat times my 10,000 employees, but it's supposed to be for entertainment purposes. So I think it's very like interesting time to be a person in charge of picking stacks, because it's just like, oh, you want me to spend $250,000 on your product this year, but you're calling it a Ouija board. So, do you see a lot of like pressure to adopt newer technologies, or do you feel comfortable and kind of like, let's just see where this ends up?
Well, there's pressure, in our business to go cheaper, and at some point, you get it to where it's so cheap that it doesn't perform acceptably anymore, and so we've chosen not to the bottom. In some cases, that hurts you with people, but I try to avoid, having claims and issues, because every one of that is you don't need to be picking over bones with your. So, I would call, the weasel words, you like what you were just saying, that is really for entertainment. That's a weasel. That's a weasel. Weasel out of it deal. But you're not going to pay your employees if they're not going to use it for business, because you don't want them. You're not paying them to entertain themselves during the day. So I don't know. I think all that's, I would try not to go down that path if it were me.
Yeah, like I've had many jobs in my life. Like in high school, my uncle was a general contractor, and so I spent a couple summers renovating houses, right? And we would renovate houses from the 30s that were built by immigrants by hand. So you have good wood, but crazy practices. Like you see, like, oh, this house almost burned down 5 times because of electricity.
Yeah, right.
And then you saw 60s houses that were like made from kits, but the wood was not as good. And now you see these modern houses, which are basically like IKEA wood, but they're made specifically, and all the parts are exactly tolerant. And so when you put on new stuff, it kind of fits. And I think technology is like that too, where you get a better, more efficient version of the thing that's more repairable, but you also have to repair it more. And I think that is kind of like difficult for people who have led technology or companies for a long time to know. It's like, well, yeah, we could go cheaper, and you're going to have a 15-year roof and not a 30-year roof. And so it's kind of hard, especially for people who are like, their company's being judged quarter to quarter, to say, well, in a 30-year time frame, it's not cheaper. Yes. How do you
well, that's right.
And how do you like, I guess that goes back to relationship, right? Like you have to have, like, they have to trust that your opinion is more important than that quarterly hit, right?
Well, that reminds me, when I sold what had been a family business for 50, 60 years to Shaw, which was a big corporation. They didn't have that same pressure each quarter on them, because they were not publicly traded, but they did have pressure because they were owned by Berkshire Hathaway, which was publicly traded. And I think that's one of the advantages of a company like Berkshire, which is really the brainchild of Warren Buffett, and he's a long-term thinker, and so at Shaw it was pretty much long-term thinking. But at Anderson, which is what the company that I sold to them, we were very long term because it was all family business. My kids were the fourth generation in that business. So you're thinking of perpetuating it. And, that's in some ways to be able to think long term is a luxury. When you're starting up, everything's a little more urgent. But, when we had it was a different kind of relationship once we sold to Shaw, because all the people that had basically been in Anderson, we would spend a lot of time just working on ideas for new things, and we wouldn't bet the farm on any of it. But we had like what you would call skunk works, where, well, let's come back tonight when everything's shut down and let's see if some of this stuff can work. That didn't really happen at Shaw because they had so many employees. Everybody had an idea. They couldn't let everybody access the plant at night. So you had to go through so much, approval and paperwork and stuff that, it was just almost too much trouble to do it. So I think if you can think long term, certainly, you have to pay your bills and all of that, but, eventually, you have to be there in the long term. But long term to me, is what pays off. You build in a little bit of armor plating as you have a longer term idea, and then you have another one, and you're kind of protecting the enterprise as you create those things. Short term,
No,
you trade tomorrow's future for next month or next quarter.
well, and I think that is really telling because, well, I think it's really telling because the people in my generation, like I've sold to companies, right? And my generation value is in my knowledge, my expertise, but I would love to have a company I've worked on for 20 years to hand on to my people. And I think there is a very lack of expertise of like what is long-term value look like. And it's not like having a lottery ticket of an exit or selling a company, right? We have a few minutes for the last question, but before I let you go, what do you think you would tell younger you starting out today? What would you do different?
Oh my gosh. I think I would maybe be more satisfied with life. I was able to do things that I enjoyed. Most of the things, and this is kind of why I got bored with retirement. I like to fish, deep sea fishing. It doesn't matter to me what kind of fishing, fly fishing in Montana and Alaska. I got to do a lot of those things, but I did them with customers and I did them with suppliers and I did them with
Yeah.
employees. And your friends kind of become the people in the business. And when you retire, those people are busy working with somebody, and so I guess everybody says, smell more roses along the way. I got to do a fair amount of that. Maybe I would do a little more, but that's the one regret I had was, I felt like, the business being left in this direction. I had a lot of reasons, and I think they were turned out to be correct to sell business. But I feel like maybe the next generation, was kind of left on the road, even though they've got resources. So,
Yeah.
Did I break up?
Well, no, you're good. You're good. Don, that was a great conversation.
Okay.
Where can people reach out to you and talk to you more? What's a good place to find you?
Well, they can reach me at eastparagon.com, and it's east to northeast west. Paragon is PA, and we have an info. They can just send me something addressed to me, and it all comes to my desk. We're still small enough I can.
Great. So I will put the info in the link. And thanks a lot, Don. Thanks for having us on.